Good day to our podcast listening friends of the Scuttlebutt podcast, hosted in the Associated Foundations Training Center. And David waved off the introduction to me today. Once again, Jonathan. I don't know if I have a nickname yet.
Award winner.
Award winner.
We haven't had the award winner here for a while.
None that we'll share with you. Present anyway.
I've re-entered the scene at this point for a short, brief period of time before I head out on travels again. And in the room, I guess we'll have David talk about himself for a second, and then go around the room.
I get in trouble for that. I got a comment. I was talking too much about myself on one of these. So I'm David Camfield. I'm the Vice President, Chief Information Officer, Chief Technology Officer, and have the distinction of being an Iowa vet, having served on here from 87 to 89.
Cool. Mike Getcher, I'm the Executive VP, Chief Operating Officer, Chief Engineer, or Chang, I guess, in the language. Merchant Marine guy, long ago, nonprofit dude, and my son is on a boomer in the Pacific somewhere.
There you go.
Has your nickname changed from Nuts and Bolts yet?
No.
No, you're still Nuts and Bolts. And then we got the Ice Queen.
Yeah.
Kyle's been much more fun. He's got a lot of nicknames now.
And then Moran, who are you?
Marianne Bangler. I just got a new title, Communications Specialist for the Office of the CEO.
Oh,
and
that's
I'm
so
the
nice.
Producer in here.
Great. And then who are you today?
Kyle Obby. I'm the rainmaker. I've got a whole bunch of buckets in my office.
Are you dancing again?
Yeah. I'll
Rainmaker
close the
with
door.
buckets.
I've got 6 buckets in my office right now. They're only about half full, so I can do at least one more storm. Yeah.
And I thought Ross, our CFO, was a rainmaker because he washed his Corvette and it hasn't stopped raining.
And now he's got a
since.
hole in his roof, but that's a whole nother podcast story.
For Charlie's benefit, Kyle's office is right at the expansion joint of the superstructure. So it's a constant source of
You get used to the little
dribbles.
You
right
have a water
behind me.
You have a water element in your office now.
It's a water
great.
feature.
People would
I
pay
do
for that.
And if
So-
I get thirsty, I don't have to go outside to get another water
Guys,
bottle.
you're so busy talking about
We
yourself.
forgot the guest.
We forgot the guest.
We've
So,
been together for a while, Charlie.
joining us today is a special guest and a friend, Rear Admiral Charlie Brown, U.S. Navy retired. And I'll let Charlie, why don't you give yourself just a brief introduction of who you are and why you matter to this world, I guess.
Oh, wow.
Wow. That sounded really bad.
Hey, Jonathan, everyone, thanks so much for allowing me to join you today. Really looking forward to the conversation. As Jonathan mentioned, I'm Charlie Brown. I'm recently retired. Well, retired this past summer. I was the Navy's Chief of Information in my final job, in my flag officer job, which essentially means I was in charge of public communication for the Navy. That's after a 28-year career as a Navy public affairs officer. So spent almost all of those 28 years in jobs where I was working with the media, working with communities, helping to connect Americans with their Navy from the West Coast here in San Diego, up and down the coast. Had some jobs on the East Coast, including a few tours in D.C. in the Pentagon. And some jobs overseas as well. So again, really glad to be on with you today. Looking forward to this conversation, and also just want to thank you for all that you do on Iowa to help connect Americans with their Navy.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm going to kick off with just a first opening salvo question and say, over 28 years of really being in the public affairs community of the Navy, what kind of shift have you seen in society in connecting to the Navy and understanding what the Navy does, and what kind of change have you seen from the point you started 28 years ago to where it's at today?
Yeah, that's a broad question, a great question, Jonathan. I mean, that there have been so many changes. I mean, some of the changes, the Navy exists in society, and so as we've all seen, the way that Americans get information, the way that we share information with each other, that's changed drastically in the last 28, 30 years. When I first started in Navy public affairs, it was we were just getting email on ships. There was no social media. The internet was really a collection of very kind of rudimentary World Wide Web pages. I was doing HTML, kind of hand jamming it in to create the first website for Naval Air Force Pacific here in San Diego as an ensign and Lieutenant JG. And so we were really at the very beginning stages of what was then called new media and what's now just how we share information. So that's kind of the bigger context of the way the Navy's changed. As society changed and social media and the internet all developed, the Navy kept pace with that, and that was certainly a change that I saw go throughout my career. Everything from social media like Twitter and Facebook and those kind of different platforms, up to adjusting to mobile and those kind of developments, and all those technological and kind of diffusion of innovations that happened. The Navy tried to keep pace with, just like most government agencies did. But also, kind of specific to the Navy, I would say one of the challenges, and certainly one of the changes in the last few years, was that for the most part of that 28 years, we were very much as a country involved in a ground war in Afghanistan and then Iraq. And so while the Navy very much supported those efforts, it wasn't a sea-based conflict. And so I think most Americans didn't necessarily see the immediate relevance of the Navy. The first airstrikes in Afghanistan, landlocked country, were from the decks of aircraft carriers. But most people don't realize, the reach of the Navy, the importance of the Navy, and really the Navy Marine Corps team, which led the way in a lot of aspects in both Afghanistan and Iraq. But as the country extricated ourselves from those conflicts that were again land-based mainly, there came a much greater amount of attention being paid to China, and the Navy over the past 20 years or so has been aware and has been very focused on the challenge that China presents to our country, and really to like-minded nations in the Western Pacific and throughout the world. China uses coercion. The CCP, the Communist Party in China, very much uses coercion and threats in order to get other nations to go along with their rules, which don't necessarily comport with international law. And as that has happened, in the South China Sea, in Africa, and other places around the world, and as the Chinese Navy has grown to be the largest Navy in the world now, surpassing the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Navy has certainly been focused on that challenge, but the American public, I think, was not as much until I think the last few years. Both the pandemic and some of China's really aggressive actions, I think, have put a little more attention on the challenge out there and on the competition that we're in with China. But at the same time, you still have what's going on in Ukraine and Russia's aggression there. That's drawing attention away from that, from the challenge that China presents. So the U.S. Navy, just like I think any other organization in the country, is always trying to make sure that we're connecting with the public in a way that the public is paying attention. There's been a lot of focus on recruiting challenges, and all the services are facing recruiting challenges. But as the Navy's Chief of Information, my kind of scope went far beyond recruiting. The Navy is looking to bring in, say, about 50,000 people a year, to recruit about 50,000 young Americans a year into the service. But really, there's 330 million Americans who are invested in our Navy. And so we really need to reach everyone with an explanation, with a good message that shows the value that they are getting from their Navy. So that's been my focus during my career. Like I said, technology has certainly changed a lot of that. Geopolitical events have changed the context where those connections were being made. But in the long run, that we're a maritime nation, and I think most Americans do recognize that our economy, our future, our prosperity all rides on the waves around the world, and the Navy really protects that.
Yeah.
So Kyle, you're of the age of being recruited. So why don't we ask you that
still.
question? Yeah. I mean, you could be a reserve. So what is, I'm going to ask you a question, put you on the spot. What is your opinion? Why don't you join the Navy, or would you join the Navy?
I would, like I get very seasick. So if I could be land-based, that'd be great. It just wasn't my calling. I think that in the past couple of years, I've definitely grown a greater appreciation. I have family members that have served in every single branch except Space Force, and it was always around me, and it was something that I knew people did and was very important. I just didn't do it. Yeah. I think that, many others probably feel the same way, but I was probably much more exposed to having family in the military. I think it goes back to kind of what Charlie was saying, is there's no public awareness of what's going on because it's not immediately in front of us. I think what was going on in the Middle East was probably, when I was growing up, the most prevalent piece of the military. I mean, we knew that bad things were happening, but it wasn't here. And then also the Navy's not involved. And you kind of lose sight of all those things behind the scenes that are really happening in America because of all the things happening in other places of the world. But until there's that bridge and awareness built, you're not going to see people responding in the form of signing up to serve.
It seems remote.
Yeah. It seems like it's very, very far away, but in reality, it's in your backyard.
Yeah.
I grew up with a dad that was a battleship sailor in World War II, and so you end up with those stories, and that's part of your life. That's, in fact, part of my family story. And for me, even though I didn't go into the Navy, I certainly appreciated that. It was a huge component, and of course I had a history interest as well. Ultimately, my son went to the Naval Academy and is now on a submarine. But it's a different world. So many people that we run into out here almost don't even understand what the Navy is. I mean, there's a really fundamental misunderstanding. They think it's people running around with M16s or M4s, and there's a huge loss. People don't know what a battleship is. Anything that's gray is a battleship. There's so much knowledge gap.
Yeah, well, I think there's a disconnect between what people's jobs are in the Navy and what they do in the civilian world. Like, my grandfather served on a ship in World War II. I knew he was an engineer. I did not connect that he learned how to be an engineer because he was in the Navy. And so I think that a lot of people don't really understand that there are so many other skills that are not just pulling a trigger on something. There are so many other things that you can apply in the real world that affect everything you're doing because of the skills and the background that you're learning in the Navy.
Well, and I think 99% or more of the job is not pulling a trigger, to be honest with you. It's more training and oriented around, doing exercises and humanitarian assistance. And I mean, and Charlie, with that being said, like, what, as you sat in there for 3 years, obviously you dealt with a wide variety of circumstances from COVID to, I don't even want to go down the list, but it is, you had a unique time, I think, in our nation's history, and the shift to the China focus with COVID kind of, bolted on top of that. And what would you say that you saw being the biggest impact on the American public? Like, where did the American public really kind of start to connect with their Navy? What created that biggest impact? What did that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd argue that there's no silver bullet, right? There's no one single thing that kind of gets everyone's attention. I mean, until you go back to something like Pearl Harbor, where people very much saw, hey, we've got a threat at sea. There isn't anything like that immediate. It's a culmination of many little things. A lot of the discussion that you all were just talking about, starting with Kyle, was about relevance. Why does the Navy matter? What does the Navy do? Remote, was mentioned. What the Navy does is by definition remote from the shores of the U.S. But we need the Navy to do that because the United States has global interests, and so we need a global force to help represent those interests. I think the challenge is making those connections. All the services face this demographic change. If you go back to the turnover to the all volunteer force, where we used to have a conscription force, and we went to an all volunteer force. A few of you mentioned parents, grandparents having served in the Navy, but those numbers of people who know someone in their immediate family who have served in the Navy have gotten progressively smaller.
Yeah.
And so because of that, the awareness of what the Navy does, the understanding of why the Navy is relevant, it's not always immediate. And a lot of it is, the Navy's a little bit of a victim of their own success. Really, since the end of World War II, there has not been a threat to commerce at sea, to the freedom of the seas. When a episodic challenge comes up, people's attention very much turns to the fragility of freedom of the seas. I think back to the ship being stuck in the Suez, a couple of years ago now, right? All of a sudden, people were very much attuned to the impact that has to any disruption in the flow of commerce on the oceans, the impact that has on the economy, both the U.S. economy, but also the global economy. That was one really, fairly isolated in time and space incident. But the entire economic system of the world, and certainly of the U.S., very much relies on that commerce moving freely. And through most of world history, that was not a given. But for about the past 75, 80 years, it's been something we've been able to take for granted. And so because of that, I think people don't necessarily recognize the relevance of the Navy day to day to Americans' way of life. It's something that I was always surprised at. We talk a lot about 70% of the Earth is covered by water. 80% of the population of the Earth lives within a few hundred miles of the coastline. 90% of our international trade rides on the sea, and about 99% of international commerce runs on cables that go underneath the sea. The internet is not a bunch of lightning bolts going up to satellites. It is mainly signals being sent on cables that go under the oceans. So with all of that said, we have the world's most powerful Navy, though, again, not the biggest Navy right now. The Chinese have that, but we have the world's most powerful Navy, the most powerful Navy in history. We have technological ways to stay more connected with our Navy than we've ever had in the past. And yet, really for the last 10, 15, 20 years, when you ask Americans which armed service is most important to national defense, the Navy typically ranked last. You would rank the Air Force, the Army, the Marines all above the Navy up until about 3 years ago. And that was something that when I came into the job as the Navy's Chief of Information, I kind of challenged all of our communicators to change that, because the reality is, the Navy is very relevant to the nation, and we have to make sure that we're showing that to our country.
Charlie,
it's not easy, but it's something that is worth doing. Go ahead.
Yeah, Charlie, can you get into a little bit some of what you did as Chief of Information? Because we were talking about jobs that people don't know are in the Navy. It'd be great to hear something about that.
Well, what is a day of what is a day in the life of the Chief of Navy Information?
Yeah.
CHINFO.
Oh, I wish there was a simple routine. I would tell Navy officers who are looking to become public affairs officers, or people graduating college, from communication programs who are looking to become Navy public affairs officers. I would tell them right up front, if you like routine, this is not the job.
Exactly. Yep.
It is something different every day. That's not every job in the Navy. There's a lot of routine in the military in general, but public affairs, we don't really enjoy a routine every day. It's filled with variety, and it's one of the things I enjoy the most. Public affairs officers in general, in the Navy, but certainly the other services as well, as I mentioned, they're responsible for public communication. And that includes working a lot with the media. And so my last job, I was in the Pentagon, and we had, a group of Navy public affairs officers there working in my office, the Office of Information, about 50 people total. And that includes civilians, uniformed people. And, a good portion of what they were doing were working with the Pentagon press. The U.S. is one of the only country, I think it's the only country in the world where our media works right within our military headquarters, our national military headquarters. You don't go to other countries and see the freedom of the press at work like you do in the Pentagon. You can be standing in line in the food court, and the person, standing behind you can be a reporter. That's really, I think, a powerful message about freedom of the press in this country. And we took our obligation seriously to make sure we're sharing information and being as transparent as possible with the press. We're also working with communities throughout the country, and that includes, museum ships like Iowa. It includes, the fleet weeks that happen throughout the world, like the one that happens in LA. So we're doing those kind of community events all the time. We worked with Hollywood quite a bit. So while I was in the seat, we worked with the teams producing Midway, producing Devotion, and of course producing Top Gun Maverick. And those were three great films, and they're very important ways to connect with the American public, because a lot of the American public, that's what they know about the Navy. But it also highlights a challenge, right? When, Jonathan, I know you and I have talked about this before, when we ask Americans, which of the services have aircraft carriers, about 40% of Americans thinks the Air Force operates aircraft carriers. So there is that gap in information that we're constantly trying to close, to help people understand that the Navy flies from aircraft carriers, that those pilots in Top Gun those are Navy pilots. The pilots in the Blue Angels, those are the Navy Blue Angels. It's not an Air Force pilot. There are some Marines in there too, but they're all naval aviators. So yeah, that was kind of the day-to-day was media, was community relations, and of course internal information, command information, sharing information with sailors and their families and veterans to make sure they understand what's happening in the Navy, kind of workforce and communication. That was also an important part of the job. So it was busy. I mean, there's about a couple of thousand, up to 4,000, people throughout the Navy who have some role in public communication. But, that's in an organization that has 330,000 people in uniform, not to mention all the civilian employees and reserve sailors that are out there. So a pretty small percentage of people involved in actual communication, but I had the privilege of leading that team, and it was really exciting, very rewarding, and could be stressful at times. Jonathan, you mentioned the pandemic. We had some other crises that came up, and trying to make sure that we weren't only focused on the crisis, but also focused on kind of what we were trying to accomplish long term. That was a daily struggle.
So okay, I'll ask one last question. So what does a retired Navy Chief of Information do now with his day?
Right now I've got a new puppy, so I'm spending a lot of time with her.
Comes on podcast.
Yeah, comes on podcasts.
Yeah, I spend a lot more time with the puppy than with podcasts. But so I am incredibly blessed to be married to a very successful, intelligent, and beautiful woman who is way more successful and important in her career than I was in mine. And for the past few years, certainly, she has been very much supporting my career. And so now I've had an opportunity to spend some time supporting her, and that's been really rewarding. So my wife, Kay Sweetser, she's a professor at San Diego State University. She leads a center there, and she also is a Navy Reserve captain, a captain in the Navy Reserve. So she, as I mentioned, she's incredible, and I was very fortunate to have her support during the past few years when my schedule was crazy, and now I've got some more time to help her with her crazy schedule, and that's been that's been really gratifying.
Good. So, any closing questions or comments?
I don't think so.
Is your wife? Is she
The
standing
Pentagon
behind
press,
looking at you?
Barbara Starr is a lot tougher than you guys. I will tell you that.
we try not to be tough, Charlie. We're trying to be friendly here.
We'll have you on again, and we'll grill you a little harder.
Yeah, I have a feeling this won't be the last time we see you. I mean, you've been incredibly helpful for our team and involved with what we're doing here and helping continue to push forth some of these outreach initiatives like what we do at the Iowa and Fleet Week and the Surface Navy Museum. And we're appreciative to have you involved in that.
No, Jonathan, like I said, I can't thank you and your team enough for all that you do for the Navy and for the country. I mean, since we first met, about 10 years ago, and we were working on Los Angeles Fleet Week when I was down here in San Diego with 3rd Fleet. All through the time I've known you and the team you lead have just been such great partners to the Navy and doing such important work, connecting what has traditionally been a Navy port up there in Los Angeles, which no longer has, a routine Navy presence, Navy fleet home ported up there. We don't have that there anymore, but we still have people, a lot of people there who are very much invested in our Navy and helping to connect those folks with what the Navy does, how our history as a maritime nation is just as important as our future as a maritime nation. I can't thank you enough. So thanks for having me on. Really enjoyed the conversation and certainly look forward to helping you and the team however I can.
Thank you, Charlie. Yeah. And I think with that said, Los Angeles has become very much a Navy town, as interesting as that is. It's fun to watch, and people are incredibly supportive of the U.S. Navy and what we do here. So unless there's any other closing comments, we can close out this Scuttlebutt, and we'll see if I'm on the next Scuttlebutt. They may kick me back out of the room and tell me to go do what I do so they can go about their business. But thank you, Charlie, and thank you, everybody, and look forward to joining another one of these soon.
Yeah, thank you. And for those listening, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, we can't do rude gestures. We tried that. Doesn't work real well. But shoot us an email at podcast@labattleship.com. How does that go, David?
Podcast@labattleship.com.
Very French.
Yes.
And if you'd like to make it rain in our accounting inbox here, pacificbattleship.com/donate.
Yeah, there you go. All right.
Kyle doing his job.
What is it? Make it rain. I forgot what movie that was. Dodgeball?
Could be. I don't know.
Make it rain. Anyways, okay. All right,
okay,
sorry.
Scuttlebutt out. Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks,
Charlie.
Thank you.
We're falling apart quickly here.